I'm back today with another video on Longhorn, and this one comes in the wake of some exciting news from Rancher. Rancher announced this week that Longhorn was accepted into the CNCF as a sandbox project, and that's an absolutely massive nod to the value of the project. By being part of the CNCF, Longhorn will be visible to users of other cloud-native technologies, and that in turn will result in it being used by people who may never have heard of Rancher. Wait, there are people who've never heard of Rancher? Those poor people! Doing Kubernetes the hard way. We have to save them. Remember that Longhorn works with any Kubernetes cluster, and Rancher is excited to see the community grow and to receive contributions to the project from new participants. One of the coolest features of Longhorn is its ability to have a volume in another cluster on standby for disaster recovery. The way that this works is that Longhorn makes a backup to an NFS or an S3 endpoint, and because of the way that the data is stored, you can safely use the same endpoint for backups from all of the Kubernetes clusters that run Longhorn. So every cluster can see every backup from every other cluster. This is cool for manual restores, but what you want is an automatic restore to a standby volume so that if there's a problem, you're as close as you can be to having the data online. When you tell Longhorn to create a DR volume from a backup, it pulls the endpoint and applies any backups that it finds to the local volume. When the proverbial duck hits the water, you can tell Longhorn to activate this volume, and then you can use it in the other cluster. But how do we actually do it? I have two single node clusters running out in AWS. We'll configure an IAM user and an S3 bucket for Longhorn backups, and then we'll install Longhorn into the clusters. After that, we'll use the multi-cluster apps feature of Rancher to install MariahDB in both clusters, and then we'll install WordPress the same way, configuring it to talk to the MariahDB installation. This will give us two little islands of WordPress running in each cluster. Cluster A is going to be the DR cluster, so we'll spin down the workloads over there and delete the persistent volume for MariahDB. Then we'll set up the backup and the DR volume like I described above, and after creating some content in WordPress, we'll simulate a failure of the primary database node and execute a DR failover to the secondary. Easy, right? Come on. All right, so first we need an S3 bucket. The UI for this is simple. You give it a name, you block public access to it, and then you set it to be in the same region as our primary cluster, and you save. Now go create an IAM user. Give it programmatic access and a name that you'll remember. Don't put in any groups or attach any policies to it, just save it. AWS will complain that it has no access to anything, and that's fine. Save the access key and the secret key because you're gonna need them later. Then select the user and under the permissions tab, add an inline policy. Switch to the JSON editor and add the policy in the Longhorn README, changing the bucket name to be the name of the bucket that you created a minute ago. Review the policy, give it a name, and then click Create Policy. Now go back to Rancher. Once again, we're going to install Longhorn into the Longhorn system namespace in the system project. Because we know our S3 credentials, we're going to create a secret that we can use during the installation. You don't have to do it this way. You can install it and then configure the secret afterward too. I like mixing it up. Since the secret has to live in a namespace, I'm going to first create the Longhorn system namespace, and then I'll create the secret. Put it in the correct namespace, and use the keys AWS Access Key ID and AWS Secret Access Key. Save that, and then go over to the Apps tab. Click Launch, search for Longhorn, and click View Details. It'll pull up the Longhorn system namespace automatically, and you can scroll down to the backup target. The format is S3://bucket name at region name, ending with a slash. Tell it the secret where the credentials are located, and then scroll down and click Launch. It takes a minute to come up, but I don't want to keep you waiting, so let's keep moving. Okay, I just installed it in the other cluster too, so we're ready to move on to the database install. Multi-cluster app installations are at the global level, and they work exactly like standard installations from the app catalog. Choose the target projects from the clusters that Rancher knows about, and it'll perform the installation into each of them. For MariahDB, we configure a database username for our WordPress database and enable persistent storage using the default storage class. We'll turn off replication since we only have one node, and then we'll launch it. This will come up, and if we jump over to cluster B, we can see that the installation is moving ahead and we have one volume in Longhorn. Jumping over to Longhorn for cluster A, we can see that we also have one volume over there, and now our database installation is done. We want our WordPress installations to be able to talk to MariahDB, but as they're installed now, each of the databases has a namespace-specific name, which makes the services unique. To fix this, we'll jump into the Service Discovery tab and add an alias in the default namespace pointing MariahDB to the local service name in each cluster. That way, when we move on to our WordPress installation, we can point it to the external cluster name of MariahDB.default, and it will find its way to the actual service. We'll configure the database username and password, set the database name, and then set a host name of wordpress.channel.monoc.us. Now, I didn't enable persistent storage on WordPress because it needs a storage class that supports read-write-many access, and I didn't build an NFS server for this demo. It's okay though, because we're not really deploying a production WordPress site. We're just using it as an example. So I'm just gonna edit etc hosts on my laptop to set the address of the B cluster, and ta-da! We're in business. I'll let you in on a secret. You're probably wondering why I'm starting with cluster B. And it's because I pasted the wrong address into etc hosts when I made the screencast, and I didn't realize it until several minutes from now. So we're just gonna roll with it. I want you to know that we're replicating real data, so I'm gonna create a couple of blog posts and change some values real quick. There's nothing major here. There's nothing that is even really all that interesting. It's just enough to change the site away from the defaults and give it a little bit of super basic content. Okay. So over on Cluster A, we can see that there's no traffic on that WordPress installation other than the liveness check. So we'll spin both of those workloads down to 0 replicas. In a DR scenario, this is how we'd want to run it. These don't need to be running, so we could even operate this cluster with minimal nodes to keep costs down. All we really care about is the data, and Longhorn is going to handle that for us. So let's jump back over to Cluster B and set up backups. We don't currently have any, so from the volume details page, we'll just go right to configuring recurring backups on a 5-minute interval. Longhorn will make a snapshot of the data and then back up the snapshot to S3. Since I don't feel like waiting, we'll just run a one-off backup now so I can get the data moving. When we jump back over to Cluster A, we see the backup there. We can choose to create a disaster recovery volume, and we'll give it the same name as the backup volume. This gets attached to a node, and the backup is restored to it. At this point, we can delete our detached volume from the MariaDB installation because we won't be using it again. We can also delete the PVC from Kubernetes just to keep things clean. So the setup is complete. Our data from Cluster B is being backed up every 5 minutes, and that data is being restored onto Cluster A every 5 minutes. That's not enough. We need to know how to promote Cluster A if there's a problem with Cluster B. So let's start by shutting off MariaDB on Cluster B. Pow! With the database down, someone's universe somewhere is collapsing. We want to go to Cluster A and tell Longhorn to activate the DR volume. This disconnects it from the restore process and makes it a real volume. We go on to tell it to create the PV and the PVC, and we're going to reuse the PVC name from the old volume on Cluster A. Doing this means that we don't have to change the MariaDB configuration. This step is a lot easier if you have a stock MariaDB installation on both nodes because the namespace is just MariaDB without the extra identifier. We can see the namespace under the PVC in this dialog, so it's easy enough to change it. When we click OK, we can see in Rancher that the PV was created and that the PVC also exists in the default project. We can now spin up MariaDB by increasing the replica count to 1. Longhorn shows that the volume is healthy, and after the database starts, well, we can spin up WordPress. All that remains is to update DNS, which I simulate by changing the IP and etc host, and the site, which previously showed a 502 error, is back online! Woo! Now, if we want, we can easily reverse the configuration. Now that Cluster A has the latest copy of the data, I first have to configure backups to S3 on a 5-minute schedule, then I can delete the PVC in the volume in Cluster B and create a new disaster recovery volume from the backup. Cluster A stays live, and Cluster B becomes the DR site. It's easy to confuse enterprise with complicated, and that makes it easy for companies to make complicated synonymous with expensive. Longhorn is free and open source, and although it's not yet in beta, it's moving quickly toward that milestone. Now that it's part of the CNCF, I imagine that it will see more activity and grow rapidly with all of the features that the community wants to see. Maybe you're one of the people who can help out. Head over to longhorn.io or to the GitHub page, link in the description, to learn more. Take it for a spin, and let me know what you think. If you're going to KubeCon this year, I'd like to meet you. Come by the Rancher booth and say hello. There'll be tons of giveaways and cool swag, and I'll be helping Rancher with a live streaming program. If you or your company uses Rancher and you'd like to spend a few minutes telling the internet about your experience, you can reach out to me over Twitter or LinkedIn, and we'll see about getting you into one of the available time slots. Have a great week. I'll see you next time.